we have people who maybe are bilingual in this sense and fans of games who are looking at the original Japanese text and then the English text and seeing the differences and making the assumption that this was a rogue translation team.
The vast majority of criticism that I see online levied towards translations is that they changed something. But to my mind, a far more prevalent problem is when they don't do enough and you end up with something that's dead on the page or dead on the screen. And that more than anything else is a disservice to the original.
Welcome back to the State of the Arc podcast. My name is Mike.
My name is Kason.
And today we are joined by a very special guest. I have been wanting to do this specific episode for quite a while now. And we're joined by somebody who I think a lot of our audience knows. We have spoken a lot about his work in the past on the channel and the games that we've covered. For many, many years, he was a professional Japanese to English translator and is now working currently as a game writer, and is best known by most of you for his translation work on games like Vagrant Story, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, and Final Fantasy XII. Please join me in welcoming Alexander O. Smith to the show. Alex, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Oh, I can't even tell you how excited I am for this episode. Maybe we should lead off just by talking a little bit about why we wanted to do this. And I kind of wanted to get maybe your overall thoughts and your beat. What I've been seeing a lot of, I would say mostly in maybe the last 2 years, is just a lot of criticism, skepticism, maybe even some vitriol towards a lot of games coming out now. It seems like almost with every major Japanese game that's releasing, I think maybe the current one that I've seen a lot of people, stirring the pot about is Metaphor Refantasio. It seems like there's a controversy almost every time about how the English version is somehow dramatically altering the original intention and meaning of the Japanese text. So we have done a video about this probably about 2 or 3 months ago, talking a little bit about our thoughts as to, trying to add some nuance to this conversation. And I think that that's what we're trying to do today. It's very easy, I think, for people who haven't worked in the world of Japanese to English game translation to be critical of it, to assume the reasons behind the choices that are made. And so I wanted to bring someone on who is an expert in that area and whose work most of us who, have played the games and enjoyed the games that we've talked about on this podcast, we've admired the work of Alex here and think that his voice is very valuable. So I guess to lead off, Alex, how much of this have you seen and what are your thoughts on the way people are going about talking about this topic?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And it's a huge question, and it's not just a question that I think people in localization face because they're getting criticism or there's one kerfuffle or another going on, but it's actually a question we have to ask ourselves as part of the work. Yeah, how far do you take something when you're bringing a product from one market to another market? And so it's almost like the last person you need to remind of the delicacy of changing things and putting things is someone in localization, because it's literally what we think about all the time. And I'm also, just to kind of set the stage, I'm absolutely not here to defend localization in any way. I'd much rather have an informed conversation on both sides, so people know, what people in localization are up to, and people in localization know what the audience wants, and what the audience is up to, and what they're looking for. So if we get any closer to that, I'm happy, and that's kind of why I'm here today.
That was something that I definitely wanted to lead off with in this conversation. Like almost the first thing I wanted to do, and I have it in the notes here, is to try to establish some good faith, right? Like we are not here to like sit on one side of this issue. We know that there are and have been on many, many projects legitimate criticisms levied at the choices that were made and maybe some of the reasons behind why that is. We're not going to get into the details or sort of pick on specific projects or, certain people, but we at least want to, extend that olive branch and say, like, we recognize that there of course are examples like this. But at the same time, I think it's so easy to sort of jump on a train of people who are so angry and upset that I see a lot of assumptions being made. And that's usually what bothers me, is seeing people make assumptions as to the reasons behind this. And I thought maybe somebody like Alex could come on and like set the record straight as to like what the real process is and why some of these changes sometimes are necessary.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to get into the weeds on that side of things, at least.
Yeah. Kaysen, did you have anything there that you were wanting to add? I kind of talked over you there.
Oh, no, not at all. Just in general, the differences of Japanese and all of that stuff. It's fun. I the way that I see it, of course, is like a Dunning-Kruger effect, that people will learn a little Japanese and then they slowly pick up on, hey, wait a second, that's not what that person said. And then they feel like there was an intentional issue here, whereas there are many translators who know Japanese quite well, and there might be reasons why they did that. So
yeah. So the first thing I wanted to ask you was what inspired you to become fluent in Japanese, like, and how did Japanese culture sort of play a role in that decision? Did you grow up with manga and anime and maybe Japanese video games? What was it that made you passionate to pursue that career course?
So, full disclosure, I'm 51 years old, which means that I was growing up in the U.S., in the rural U.S., actually. It's northeastern Vermont.
Oh, Vermont.
In the 70s and 80s. My access to Japanese culture, or what you might think of as modern Japanese culture, these days was extremely limited. I was entirely unaware of it, I would say. It would be a good summation of my experience with Japan. I'd never met a Japanese person that I knew. I had never eaten Japanese food. I was completely a noob as those things go. And maybe not the answer you want, but I had zero interest in Japanese culture.
Oh, wow.
I actually went to China in the last year of high school. This was in 1990. And it was part of what was planned to be a huge exchange between a rural American school and a rural school in China.
Right.
And they set it all up, and it was going to be something like 20 kids, I think, from each school for a year. And then the Tiananmen Square incident happened.
Yeah, I was going to say 1990. Interesting.
Yeah, it was 89 was when that happened. I guess they were setting it up in 88. And then in 89, you had Tiananmen, and China's like, whoa, we're not doing this. We're not sending students.
Yeah.
And America's like, please. And so eventually they came out with a compromise, which was from the US, they would send 2 teachers and 1 student. And from China, they sent a Chinese English teacher and a party official. So it wasn't much of an exchange.
Were you the one student?
I was the one student, and it wasn't
gosh.
free. It wasn't for a year. It was for about 3 months, I think.
Oh, okay. That's fascinating, though. Wow.
Yeah, so that kind of got me, and I'd been interested in languages before, which I think is why I was chosen for this. And then that just kind of like kicked it off, and I got really into studying Chinese. And then it was literally, and I still have this actually, it was an airline menu on the flight on the way back, which routed through Tokyo. And the airline menu had Chinese, Japanese, and Korean on it, and English. And I don't remember exactly, but I think looking at it, I realized that Japanese had a different way of representing foreign loanwords. This is super nerdy, sorry.
Yeah.
The Chinese uses what in Japanese is called ateji, but it's like it's characters that they use to represent something else. Mm-hmm. And so when they have to say something like Coca-Cola, they use Coca-Cola, and it sounds a bit like Coca-Cola, but it always felt really inelegant to me. And I think looking at the menu, I realized that where the Chinese was using these loan word combinations, Japanese had some new, weird, cool, streamlined Thanks. This is katakana for anyone who's
Yes.
paying attention. And
Simpler.
yeah, exactly. And I thought, oh, that's elegant. In retrospect, maybe it's not as elegant as just writing the words in English, but whatever. I was really excited about it. And so when I got back to the States in Vermont, I switched and I started studying Japanese. I had cassette tapes. Anyone knows what those are?
What was it, the Pimsleur method, or was it
this was Pimsleur probably existed, but I didn't have access to it. I don't even remember, honestly. Although one thing is, if anybody's trying to learn Japanese or any language for that matter, I think one thing that I did that was in retrospect very smart was I used as many different books and as many different sources as possible. I wasn't just using one system. And some of them were really hard, which probably they weren't very well designed, but they were just, really, really, high threshold. And then others were very easy, and being able to kind of go back and forth and bounce around. If you're in a self-study kind of situation, I think that's really useful. Anyway.
Very good. Very good.
Started doing that, had no clue about Japanese culture whatsoever, went to Japan in the summer between high school and undergrad. And the group that I went over with was called Youth for Understanding. They did maybe a 6-week exchange, I think. And there was a week-long orientation in Seattle on the way over, at which they offered some Japanese, sort of remedial Japanese courses. And so this is my first time actually hearing Japanese spoken by live people.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. This is what, 1990? Yeah, 91. And I went up to the teacher, and they had 2 classes, one for people who had studied in high school and one for people who had never studied Japanese at all. I'm like, oh wow, I've been doing this for like half a year, like super hardcore. I want to try the intermediate course. And so I asked the teacher, and he's like, oh, I'll test you. And he said, "Onamae nan desu ka?" I'm just like, what's your name?
Yeah.
No idea what he said.
Oh, really?
Zero comprehension. Had he written it out, like I could have even read the kanji at that point, but zero idea. And he's like, you can start with the beginner course. So it was an uphill road. But I will say, just to complete the story, that I had been exposed to Japanese culture. I just didn't know it. There was one of my favorite shows on TV was Robotech, which it's the show. The original is Makorosa. Actually, it's an interesting title in terms of the discussion today, because it was put together by a producer named Carl Masak, and who's in some circles is sort of like a bête noire. It's like a symbol of what you shouldn't do when localizing a title, because what he did was he took 3 unrelated shows that were all made by the same production company, and he put them all together and made a continuous storyline out of them.
Wow. Like in some ways that's like, wow, like good job. If anybody could pull that off.
I think it's brilliant, actually. And I think for the time and with the resources they had, they did a fantastic job.
That's crazy.
And the reason why they had to do that, and this will probably also touch on this later, is because the market would not support short run cartoons. If you were going to sell a cartoon to, for the Saturday morning cartoon slots, you had to have, I forget what it was, like at least 150 shows in the can, or a plan for a long run series. They just didn't do these short run series. And so he could not sell the product in like 40 episode chunks. He had to have more. And since Japanese cartoon shows typically don't go on that long, or at least they didn't at the time, then he didn't really have a choice. Really loved the property, wanted to bring it on, and they did a great job. They brought in, they redid all the music. They brought in American singers, or a Canadian singer or two, to do the lyrics, and fantastic work. But I was really into that show. Had no idea it was Japanese. Anyway, that's the long story.
Well, we have a lot on the docket, but there's a couple things you said there that just piqued my interest to get to know you a little better. First of all, you were talking about getting super nerdy about like the technicalities of the language and things like that. Kaysen happens to be fascinated by languages. He has learned many languages himself. And so anyway, we love getting into the weeds on that kind of thing, and talking about, especially now that I'm learning Portuguese, because my wife is Brazilian. Even just in the rudimentary level that I'm at, you get to know a culture by learning their language. We really feel strongly about that. And there's something like deeply, deeply tied there into the words and how they use the words and things like that, that help you understand the culture. And I think that that's going to be a big part of this discussion. So anyway, if you want to get technical about stuff, I'm sure Kason and our audience will be fascinated about that. You don't have to feel like, you're being boring or whatever.
Awesome. I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about when it comes to high context versus low context languages, because that's actually a big part of
that's one of our questions.
Yeah, that's why localization between Japanese and Western languages is very different than between, say, French and English or German and English.
Why don't we actually start with that? I know I kind of put that question a little bit lower, but I think it might be good to do it now. Can you break down for our audience, maybe those who don't know any Japanese at all, how different are these languages fundamentally? And why does that create such a challenge for translation and localization?
Sure. I think they're different. There's sort of two ways to think about the differences between a language like Japanese and English. We'll just go with those two languages. They're the ones I'm most familiar with, and probably the ones most pertinent to our audience today. The one way to think about it is what's called context, or the level of context required in a language. Japanese is what's called a high context language, and English is a very low context language. And what that means, just in practical terms, is English tends to spell everything out for you. We like to use pronouns. In fact, you have to use a pronoun. You have to have a subject in every sentence.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it sounds very strange.
Right.
And in reverse, Japanese often doesn't use a subject. In fact, if you try to stick a subject into a sentence, it will start sounding very strange.
Right. It sounds repetitive,
It's repetitive. It's weird. Pronouns exist, but they're actually often given because they're not the sort of, he did, she did, very simple sort of pragmatic pronoun. They actually take on more meaning than they have in Western languages. So the pronoun that you might learn for him is, kare, and the pronoun you might learn for her is kanozo. But if you actually use those pronouns, you're usually talking about somebody's boyfriend or girlfriend, because the words are there. It's more important than, when you're dragging that word out into the conversation, you must mean something more by it. So and similarly, and this is something that trips up beginning learners of Japanese, and is actually something I slipped into the Square, I guess it was Square Enix at the time, translation test way back in the day, was the use of something like a personal pronoun. Like boku is the personal pronoun that little boys use to mean I. And in Japanese, you can actually point at a boy and say, what does boku want to do today? What does boku want to eat? You're actually
almost like a name.
Yeah, almost like a name, right?
That's
Whereas
crazy.
And you think about it in terms of English, it makes zero sense.
Yeah.
I guess there's some people that might say that, but anyway, that's what I mean by the sort of high context, low context. The Japanese tends to not provide that information in the syntax, and English does. And what that means when you're in a conversation is there's a lot more things that get assumed in a Japanese conversation. And in fact, you need to have this mutual understanding as you move into the conversation, as you move through the conversation, in order for any of it to make any sense. So it's very, very difficult to break in on a Japanese conversation between two other people midway through. You may have no idea what's going on because there's no subjects. So laughed a lot. Yeah, went down to the store, and you're like, who's doing what? Why? Because you don't have that context. And in taking another step back and looking even bigger picture, there's a lot of things that are assumed when you enter into any kind of social interaction in Japan that are based on a common understanding of what people do in these kind of interactions. It's this assumed cultural knowledge. Yeah. And so it's starting off from an entirely different place than English, which by necessity, I think, is much more practical and sort of in the open with all the information. People tend to lay everything out, whereas in Japanese, there's a lot of assumptions being made, and that's led to all kinds of misunderstandings.
Sure. I'm reminded now of this very issue with, say, the opening cutscene of Xenogears, for instance, which I think they had more than one translator on at the time, but a bunch of them dropped off as like they got further and further and saw how complex and crazy and possibly controversial that story could be in the West. And then, of course, Richard Honeywood ended up like taking the entire project on himself. But I think that early cutscene had been translated by a different translator who didn't have the rest of the story's context and had translated the attackers of that ship in the first scene as they, right? Like a plural pronoun, where it should have been something more like he or it, which caused a ton of confusion, right? And that's probably exactly the kind of thing you're talking about, Alex, right?
Yeah, and that's a nice, easy to understand example because it's what I'd call a mistake. I mean, it's essentially just a translation mistake, and I've seen far worse mistakes. Thankfully, not in published. Well, no, there's some in published work too, but it's a very easy kind of mistake to make if you're coming into a situation and you don't have all the information, which, surprise, surprise, is often the case in localization because these are teams that are not part of the original dev team. They're out in the woods somewhere, and they're often not given the information that they need to do a good job. Right. And so they do the absolute best they can with this sort of low information. Thankfully, this is, I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody active in the industry, maybe 10, 15 years ago, where that was very common. I think it's less and less common now because the production side is more and more aware of the kind of support that they need to give. And we were, in my little crew, as early as 16, even 17 years ago, were demanding that we had full videos of every scene in the game when we launched into a translation, because you can't just translate these things without seeing what's going on. And even if you play the game 50 times, you're not going to see, that little scene or whatever. Right. And we have a ton of translation to do, so we can't be like QAing everything. So the need for context is huge.
Yeah. I wanted to really lay that out as sort of a foundation of our conversation, because I think a lot of people who are not familiar with how difficult it is to do this work without that context. And some of these games that we cover, their stories are so complex. Like Xenogears is a great example. We have a creator here in Tetsuya Takahashi who is referencing religious symbolism and Jungian psychoanalysis and just all kinds of stuff, astrophysics, that are just complex issues in and of themselves. And so if you're not aware, beginning to end, not only of how we get from A to Z as far as the story and plot goes, but the way that all of those things play into the game's core theme, like how can you be expected to translate that and in the most accurate way possible, get across the creator's intention if you're not, like you're saying, seeing the scenes play out before you, seeing the animation, seeing it all happen. And as far as I understand it, I mean, back in the 90s, right, a lot of times they're just sending you text files without any context as to where this goes in the game or in the story. Like, what scene does this belong to, and chronologically, where does this come? Is that right?
I've been given text files where you don't even know who's speaking.
And in a context-dependent language, that is murder.
I'd say it's a disaster in any language, but far more so in Japanese.
Sure.
Yeah, so I say all of that, and I understand that the examples we're drawing on here are from, more than 20 years ago, and that things have changed since then. But to help people understand, to get generate a little bit of sympathy for the challenges that exist for the people working on, very limited sort of timescales and deadlines to translate just enormous amounts of text. These Japanese RPGs in particular are very long games that are very text heavy, and I'm sure that workload is just crazy, particularly for a small team, which is how it was done in those days.
Absolutely. It's also job security. There's a lot of text to be translated, which is nice.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But on the flip side, and I don't know what the current state of the industry is right now, although I would assume it hasn't changed that much, in that oftentimes it's not one or even two people working on these projects. It's maybe 8 people and with an editor that coordinates their efforts. And that comes with its own pitfalls. Definitely advantages, but also pitfalls. If you can, yeah.
Can you just elaborate on that? Tell us, go into
Sure.
detail on
Yeah.
that?
If you're going with a large, so I was part of a boutique translation crew, I guess you'd say, and often we would have one person or 2 people. Usually 2 people working on a game translation max. If a third person was brought in, everything they did would be vetted by both of the primary translators. And the point there was so that you can imagine if you're working with this really high context language and you're trying to make that fit into the world of a low context language like English, there's a lot of decisions you have to make almost on a line by line basis of how not only are you going to characterize things, but just how are people speaking. And you can appreciate that if you have, say, 5 people on a distributed team. So these people, they aren't even working in the same room. They're, all over the world maybe, who are all taking a chunk. And, I might translate this part of Yuna's dialogue and this person might translate that part of Yuna's dialogue. I mean, of course the voice isn't going to match up, let alone, all these other things that you have to consider when you're talking about that. So the nature of the industry and the relatively, I think, low margins that are assigned, the small budgets that are given to localization. Again, this has been changing, but determine that, you're going to have teams of multiple people working on these things. And a lot of it is just sort of crossing fingers and hoping it works out. This is not to say that is like prevalent or the main thing. I know that places that really care about quality, the dev teams that really care about quality, the Squares and the Nintendos and the Capcoms of the world, they're often running with internal teams, especially for English.
Oh, really?
They might outsource the other languages, but they've got really strong internal teams working on the other things. And, there's also agencies that do a really, really good job. So I don't mean to cast shade on any of those people, but they're often starting from a place of disadvantage.
Yeah. Thinking about that now, I mean, one thing just as a writer that can be challenging is keeping a consistent voice for the characters that you're writing throughout the story. So I can only imagine that the more translators you bring on, trying to again, make that feel consistent, like this character has these sort of quirks or the way that they go about talking, but this scene is being translated by this person on the team and this scene by another. I mean, that brings up its own challenges, right? Have you ever worked on a larger team like that where you had to kind of manage those sorts of things?
Yeah, especially the early on, I was working with a larger team over which I had no control. So was there's a lot of translation by committee is the other side of that, where you all get into a room and you sort of figure out what the best way to do things is. Also, probably not the best way to go about writing anything, but
yeah, by committee.
Yeah, exactly. But you do have to do some of those things in order to just have consistency, which is obviously really important.
Yeah. How much oversight is there, or I guess in your experience was there, from the Japanese writers? How often are they even capable of checking your work? And how maybe has that changed over the years as you've seen? And how often have you seen them making a request to the localization team for the changes that are made? So these aren't decisions being made by the translator. I guess a famous example would be on Vagrant Story that Matsuno-san asked you to make the text sound more biblical on purpose, which was not the way that was written in Japanese. How often was it true for you that was what was requested on their side? I guess I wrapped a couple questions in there. Let me step back and make it simpler. How much oversight is there on their part, and how often are they requesting changes?
It really runs the gamut depending on the team and also the era, I would say we've definitely gone in the big picture from very low input from the team to where, in that case, localization is kind of this black box, and they just cram the game in there and they hope that something comes out the other side. And when it does, they're already on to the next game by that point, because we're also not talking about, it wasn't simultaneous either. It was, you've got a dev team, they make something, 3 or 4 months later, the English version comes out. The dev team is already on the next project. They don't care. In fact, sometimes it was hard to get engineers to even make the English version work because they had already gone off different projects. So that's like the dark ages. But currently, almost everything is simultaneous release. And there is a bit more, and my understanding is that there's a bit more sort of hands-on from the dev teams. One thing that's changed a lot is not only do you have more directors and writers on the Japanese side that understand English, at least to the degree that they can, read what's been translated, but you also have a lot of native English speakers on the dev team who are going to be checking the text. And actually, this is something very unusual at the time, but there was a native English speaker on the Vagrant Story team.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Tai Yasui. He was I think, and apologies, Tai, if you're listening, I get this wrong. I think he was a producer on Vagrant Story.
Wow.
And so he actually was, I guess looking in, not literally, but looking over my shoulder to see what I was doing early on. And I think he was instrumental in bringing me in to actually just talk to Matsuno, which is also not done at the time. There was a clear separation between the dev teams and localization back, and I'm talking, early 2000s. That's been more or less erased, where you usually have a localization person embedded in a dev team now in an in-house situation.
Okay.
Even if some of the translation is being done outside or outsourced. But to just that question of, how much input they have, I would say very little, typically, just because of, they're making a game at the same time. And so they're not going to have that much bandwidth. There are some notable exceptions. I don't know how much of this was publicly broadcast, so I won't try not to out anybody, but I know there were some requests from directors of recent Square games where they specifically requested that a translation be changed, that kind of thing, in response to fan reaction. So that's an unusual case. I've had one piece of feedback about my translation over 50 games.
Like just feedback, positive or negative?
Oh, you know what? Almost pretty much. Yeah, I've had a bit of feedback, like the positive feedback, months later when nobody cares anymore. I've had that actually, but I mean real time feedback that I could act on before the game came out.
Oh, right. When it's important to have it, yeah.
When it's important to have it, yeah, exactly. And that was when I had actually made a mistake. But it's a very interesting mistake, and I
want to hear about it.
Yeah, we can either get into it now or we can get into it later. But it involves a number of other things in the sort of the constellation of this talk that we're having. One being that oftentimes the Japanese original, or any original of anything, sometimes it's not that good.
Yeah.
This is something that needs to be said, right?
Right.
And honestly, I can say, having worked on, I haven't counted them, but it's somewhere around 50 different games. I would say of those, I can count on one hand the ones that I would say were well written.
Wow.
And this is not my opinion as snooty Western translator, poo-pooing the Japanese thing. I've heard this from Japanese devs, from Japanese writers, from extremely prominent Japanese directors, saying, yeah, the writing's not that good. And there's a really good reason for that. There's no time. And there's no editorial oversight. And this is kind of a problem in a number of areas in Japan right now that I think the industry is kind of coming to terms with. But a lot of the really good storytelling talent is going into manga,
right, and
TV.
Yeah.
And so you'll see, I think, some of the best stories coming out of Japan right now. Go read manga, go watch anime, go watch live TV shows. The storytelling's solid. There's a really strong editorial feedback process, which is really important. and you just don't have the time or the interest in that for games because the emphasis has always been on the game design, essentially the gameplay.
Okay.
Is there kind of a hierarchy with the writers then there, almost like a caste system where it's like, if you're a good writer, you don't go into video games? Is that kind of a thing that's common?
Sure. Yeah, you'd be slumming it,
Hmm.
I would think. Well, Japan is all about hierarchies, so.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what's is there anything below video games for a writer, or is that the bottom?
Probably light novels.
Like, oh, okay, gotcha.
A lot, because a lot of those are written by the word. Like, we need X number of words by the state. Yeah, those get pretty trashy. I mean, obviously there's exceptions. I'm sure the light novel that you love is great, but there's a lot. there's a lot of exceptions to that. Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
Okay, there's a lot of stuff in there that I wanted to kind of dovetail off of. This is great.
Just to put a note here, Mike, I do want to hear about Alexander's interaction with Matsuno, he being one of our favorite directors ever.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. We'll definitely get to that. First is a clarification. So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this right. It sounds to me like it's much more common now that you have an internal localization team for English, especially, and that there is crossover in terms of like the release dates are obviously simultaneous for both regions. So they are talking to each other. Is it safe to assume that that's happening most of the time for these like bigger budget titles from, the bigger companies that we know of?
I'd say so, yeah.
Okay, so if we're saying that that's the case and they are working hand in hand, is this maybe a misconception that the assumption seems to always be, oh, these English localizers took this thing and just ran with it and made all these changes without consulting, the original Japanese devs on this? How I guess much of a misconception or maybe a false assumption would you say that is?
Or is it totally true?
I bet it's both. I bet sometimes you have a team for any number of probably very good reasons, I'd say, taking a project in a different direction than the dev team originally wanted it to go in. And they would have usually this is a case where you've got an agency handling the translation and a separate company handling publication. So the original company doesn't have that much control over the final product. And so the decisions, and this is probably a point that can't be stressed enough, the decisions it's not really being made by like this rogue band of localizers off in a castle or something with a moat around it. It's often a marketing decision. The whole thing, the whole process of localization, and this is maybe something also that we should discuss. I mean, it's such a large topic, but you can think of localization, and I think many people do think of it as this sort of almost like this holy act of approaching the original and trying to translate it for us down here who can't appreciate the beauty that is the original, bringing it down the mountain and saying, look, I went and this is as close as I could get. It's not like looking upon the glory, but it's pretty darn close. And, this will get you through the door, right? So you can kind of think about it. Yeah, exactly. You can kind of think about it like that, and I think probably many people do. Or you can think about it like, hey, somebody made this cool game with this cool story, and now we're going to make another game with this cool story for a different market. And what are the decisions we need to make for that market? Well, one thing is, for better or for worse, when we're selling stuff in the West or in the US, we have to watch our ESRB rating. And what do they want? Oh, they want, less exposed flesh. Okay, at the end of the day, not that big a deal, maybe. It's not the original creator's intent, but they were making that for a different market. Tough luck. You got to make something for this market. You can't sell 40 episodes. You have to glom 3 seasons together, like Carl Masek and make 200 episodes. It's a fact of where you're selling. Does that somehow is that somehow like casting aspersions or denigrating the original in some way? I would say absolutely not. And this is, if you pardon me, like a really quick anecdote. But there's sort of a famous Umberto Eco is the Italian author of The Name of the Rose. He's also, less famously for us in the US, a very prolific translator. Translated a ton of stuff that was in English into Italian. And he was sitting at his desk. I'm kind of imagining this scene, but he's sitting at his desk and one as a professor at a university, and one of his colleagues comes in holding this English book that Umberto had translated and says, you destroyed this. This is, this is this is unexcusable. How could you have done this? You've destroyed this book. And I guess he was holding the translated version of the book. And Umberto then, in my mind's eye, leans back in his chair, points up at the bookshelf behind him and says, I haven't done anything. It's right there. Right? That's the original. It's right there. I didn't touch it. If you're that concerned, go read the original. And I know that's obviously not what that's obviously not a realistic thing or a practical thing to say to everybody who's a fan of Japanese culture. Like, go learn Japanese and do the original yourself. And that's not my point. But the idea that the translation is somehow beholden to be as close as possible to the original, or it's a lesser product, I think is not correct.
Interesting.
And not really a fruitful way of thinking about the problem, because what the problem is, how do we make a product that will sell in this market? And there's a much more interesting conversation that I think brings in a lot of the same kind of feels and ideas, which is maybe the market's shifted. Maybe there's a large market that really wants this like direct transmission from the original, but doesn't speak Japanese, but they really, because they've grown up on manga and anime and and they want to be part of that culture. And I think that's great. And I think that, maybe some games, especially, certain genres of games, might actually tool their translations towards that, because maybe that's their market. I don't know. That's a marketing research problem, not really a translation problem. At the end of the day, they've got to make something that's good for the market. And I've had I think I mentioned this when we were discussing stuff before the podcast. There was this magazine published in the 80s and 90s it was out of Georgia, actually, called Manga, which was fantastic. And it had excerpts from Japanese manga and with a direct translation and grammar notes, and then a more glossed translation.
Wow.
And you could look at it and say,
that's cool.
That's how the Japanese works. That's what's going on. Oh, that's how you make it readable in English. And just laying that out as a resource, it wasn't entertainment. I will say that it wasn't like a mass market, and in fact, it went out of business because it's a pretty niche audience at that time in the 90s. Now maybe there's a larger audience for that, and maybe somebody should make that. That would be really cool. But the heavily adapted, heavily westernized localization that might cause a lot of people to kind of raise their eyebrow and say, this isn't what it said in the Japanese. I don't think that's for you. if you think it's been changed too much, maybe it wasn't made for you. Maybe it's made for a different audience. That's
very interesting.
That's
so a lot of this a lot of the blame, if we're going to use that word, what a lot of people are throwing around, is likely more towards the marketing department and less towards the translators in particular.
Or the realities of the market in general. Like if anybody's raging against the ESRB, that's so far from a translation problem. It's not even a cross-cultural problem. It's why does America have this weird hang up about sex is really your, the main issue that you've got there. You can go talk to those people. Yeah.
Can you?
This brings a couple
I'm
things.
kidding, you can't. Yeah.
You can.
Brings a couple things to my mind here. So how often would you say, or maybe would you guess, it's coming from the Japanese side as a marketing decision, or at least that the marketing departments between the English and Japanese are making the decision for the change because the goal here is to sell a game to that market versus it being, like you said, rogue translators.
Yeah, I honestly don't think rogue translators are a thing. Like, maybe once in a while. I mean, way back in the day, yeah, I knew somebody who inserted the names of all their friends in a game text. That's not cool. Nobody thinks that's cool.
Oh my God.
It's not the job.
You can't tell me what game that was, could you?
No.
Oh man,
Sorry.
that would be hilarious.
Maybe offline. I'll say.
Okay.
It wasn't in English either. That's just why it's kind of gone under the radar.
Okay.
It was Japanese to another language, but rogue translators versus sorry, the question was, how much is the Japanese, I guess you could say, self-censoring?
The Japanese marketing, yeah.
I mean, they do quite a bit because they've learned. They've released, they released a game that had something bad in it, and hey, our totally teen-friendly game just got an R rating slapped on it. I forget what the SUV ratings are. There's like whatever.
Rated M for mature. Yeah.
M. Thank you.
Yeah.
I knew it wasn't R. It got an M on it. We're screwed. Suddenly a game that was supposed to sell, even say like 40,000 copies will now sell, 30 copies. That's not going to work. Or, obviously you can aim for the M market, but that's a whole different conversation.
Right.
It's a big, it's a big deal, especially with companies like Nintendo, who have a very family-friendly image.
Yeah.
They are going to do a lot of internal, quote unquote, self-censoring for the market, as well they should, because how else are they going to bring it to market? The same considerations are going on in the dev teams in Japan when they're considering the Japanese market. These aren't sort of like acts of creation that, especially when we're talking about games, it's not like I have a vision for a perfect game and I take it from the first line of code to the final realized product and my vision was seen throughout. That's not how it works. Maybe Stardew Valley or something like that, like where it is literally one person and they're bringing a thing. But I would argue they're also heavily considering their audience and they're looking at other games. Yeah, and that's why those games are successful, and that's why they sell. And if you're in any sized company beyond a few people, that's a real consideration, because do I want to see this pure art form through to the end, or do I want to sell copies and make sure everybody on my team gets to eat?
There you go. Yeah. So that's the reality. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the reality of it. And you can call it self-censorship, but I would just call it, essentially like marketing or considering your audience. Right. And that happens as much on the Japanese side as it does when they bring those products over to the American side.
I think people have this idea that they want that there should be, it's almost like an idealized vision, that we should live in a world where one piece of art is appreciated the same by everyone in the whole world. And that there are no, boundaries or hurdles anywhere. And I don't even know if that's a good thing. I would say no. But, a lot of people kind of have this image that, you should never have to change it to accommodate, a different culture. But there's nothing in the world that can please everyone. Like, it's just not possible. So things do need to be tailored as you go into the different audience if you want to sell anything at all.
Sure. Yeah. Even in one culture.
Yeah. So what this sounds to me like is we have people who maybe are bilingual in this sense and fans of games who are looking at the original Japanese text and then the English text and seeing the differences and making the assumption that this was a rogue translation team that wanted to sort of push an agenda or something like that. And maybe something like that.
Well, that's market research, though. There is something to that, especially recently. But that, once again, tends towards our market research tells us that young Americans are into X.
Yeah. But I want to, I guess in order to be fair, and like we said, put nuance to this conversation, there may be examples of something like that happening. And I wanted to, yesterday as we were researching this, we looked up a couple of examples that where this maybe could be an issue, or where maybe a translator has admitted, like on a Twitter post or something, yeah, I made these changes. I don't feel bad about it or whatever. And quite clearly, they had some animosity toward the work in the first place. Like they didn't like certain things that were in there. So I'm not, we want to, again, be fair and say that this does happen for something maybe like Dragon Maid or Ghost Stories. But if we're talking about a global corporation like Nintendo or Square Enix or Capcom or something like that, it's probably fair to say that this is much more a marketing decision between the collaboration between the Japanese and English teams to make changes like this. Would that be fair to say, Alex?
I think that's perfectly fair.
And if you don't
And
like it, it's either not for you or learn Japanese and go.
yeah, the original's right there on the shelf.
It's right there.
Yeah, that's so it's so conceited. I love it. The other thing there is, I don't mean to say, hey, it's a marketing decision, so don't look at us, because you should absolutely look at the localization. And localizers, we have to make choices. I say we, even though maybe not active localizing right now, but in general, you have to make choices all the time. And those are not always going to be the right choices for everybody. Sometimes it's just the right choice for you at that moment. And another way to look at this, if you want a little more perspective on this, there are many famous novels like let's say the Divine Comedy.
Yes, I was thinking that actually.
Yeah, it's been translated. I forget. It's ridiculous number of times into English,
Thousands, maybe. Yeah,
maybe thousands. Yeah, and certainly even like I have a friend who collects these, and I know he's got.
I have,
right?
I have a bunch. Yeah.
Oh, seriously, I mean,
I love Dante's Inferno, and I have tons of translations.
Yeah, and that's awesome, right? And you wouldn't look at any one of those translations and say, go on at length about like the pitfalls and stuff, because each one is not only made by a person, the translator made it, so it's incorporating their take on the material, but it's also for an audience for a different time. And if you look at a translation of The Tale of Genji that was made at the early 1900s, it's going to read very, very differently than any one of the 3 translations of Tales of Genji that came out in the last decade, or 2 decades, I guess. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's a different audience, it's a different time, there's different needs. And in fact, the modern translations of Tale of Genji, one was worked on by a professor that I had in undergrad, and his tends to be it's very explanatory. You do get a sense of all the difficult hierarchies and and all of the sort of various inputs that went into the text. It's very academic, I guess is what I'm saying. And another version that also came out around the same time reads much more smoothly, and it's more of a piece of entertainment. And you can't look at either of them and say this is wrong. They have different purposes, and I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at too. But you can then take a step back and say, okay, so this was being done for entertainment, and this translation team wanted to westernize some of the concepts here. How did they do it that? Like, putting aside whether they should have, because that's more of a marketing or a moment of its time, or a decision of its time. How well did they do at marketing? Did they bring in too many memes? Are there too many things that date this? Is that something that the original text kind of did? Was that inspired by the original? Because that's a metric that I think is really important in translation. Now, after I've just spent like an hour talking about how you should ignore the original translation and do what you want, or ignore the original and do what you want. The one thing that I think is very, very important is making sure that everything that you're doing in the space of a text or a game translation is inspired by the original. Because I always feel like my job as a localizer is to bring the best of an original work to a new audience. And if I've destroyed anything in the original that lessens the value of what I made, I feel like that's a failure. Which isn't to say that I don't make failures, and everybody does. And that's where I think, criticism can be very helpful, because they can come in, they can say, hey, I get what you're trying to do here, assuming that they're fully educated and they understand all the things that are going on, like schedules and stuff like that. They say, I get what you're doing here, but what if you tried doing it something like this? Like, I would love that. In fact, I've gotten some feedback, from that. It was on novel translation, not game translation, but feedback where I was like, the guy kind of had a point where, yeah, maybe I could have taken that in a different direction. This is going way beyond whatever the original question was. But just as like an aside, the one of the things that I don't like is when a critic will post sort of a direct translation of the Japanese and compare that to the final localized product and say, look, they changed something. This is bad.
Yeah.
Because I mean, hello, it's no longer Japanese. I've gotten this from Japanese devs too, actually, where I've translated a whole game and then we'll be talking about one little like decision that was made in the thing, and they'll actually bring it up and say, I don't know why we need to like Hollywoodize our game. And I'm sitting there thinking about the last half year I just spent turning their game into something that lives and breathes in English with English speaking voice actors. I'm like, dude, that ship sailed so long ago.
Yeah.
I was literally in Hollywood for 3 months, making sure that we were way more in Hollywood than Japan, obviously with the understanding that everything is inspired by that original. And the goal is to make the translated product, sing and dance and shine in many of the ways that the original did, and to not dull any of that. So that's sort of like an important kind of guiding light. And I think any criticism that looks at that and says, okay, did you do a good job there? Is this effective? Like, that's really interesting. And you're doing everybody a disservice if you post like a direct translation, because you're not doing any of the work. And
exactly.
Yeah, and actually, I think another question you had in there is like, what about AI translation? I love Chat GPT. I'll go on the record saying that, because it does the boring, easy stuff.
Yes, the low level, the light novels, right?
Yeah, but also even within the context, it'd be really hard to use it unless you trained it specifically for this. It'd be very hard to use it for games because it's all dialogue and stuff, and very, the high context thing is also a huge challenge for AI.
Yeah.
But getting a text from, and I keep saying text, which is kind of academic, but a game, let's say game text or whatever.
Say show.
yeah, exactly. Getting a text from Japanese to English is the easy part. It's getting it to good English. That's the tough part. And then this wraps in like, do you have to be a writer? Of course you have to be a writer. In fact, when we were hiring people when I was still on staff at Square, one of the questions I'd ask in an interview is, okay, if we locked you in a room for 24 hours, we're not going to do this, but if we locked you in a room for 24 hours and said, write a novel, what would you write?
Like any of your choice?
Yeah. This is a question for a prospective translator.
Yeah.
Because if a person is coming to translation and they don't have to be writing something, like they don't have this urge to write something, I don't think they're going to bring their A game.
Okay.
I kind of want to expand on that point specifically a little bit, because this is something that going back years and years and years, even before I saw a lot of this controversy that we're seeing now about, you're not supposed to change, the words from the original Japanese.
Yeah,
I mean, we saw some of that
transliterated exactly as it was written.
We've been kind of saying this for years, and even going back to the video that I did years and years ago on Vagrant Story. I praised it, Alex, because I could tell based on the English text that you were an excellent writer. Not just translation work is being done here. This is somebody who deeply understands the art of storytelling as well. And I could see this, some of this, what we're talking about, being something that immediately raises a red flag to those sorts of people who want those like genuinely as faithful as possible types of translations. Because if you're hiring a translator who considers themselves a writer, maybe they assume there's this level of pretentiousness that comes with that, where, oh, I know better than this, Japanese writer. I can make that sing or sound better, right? So I understand the concern there, but I think what you're saying is so important for two reasons. One, and correct me if I'm wrong, so I'll just throw that out there first. It seems to me when I see people posting those like direct translation comparisons, right? Every time I read what their supposed direct translation in Japanese is, it sounds so neutral and plain and without character.
A lot of video game writing, and mentioned this earlier, is maybe not that well done. and again, this is not just my opinion. I literally I had a very long discussion with a very well-known director who will go unnamed because he doesn't need any noise from this, about this very topic, Japanese, and that was his opinion. He said it first. He's like, well, a lot of this is just not very good. And there's a number of reasons. We don't need to get into why that is. But you sent me a clip of something. We don't even need to name that, but you sent me like a screenshot of one of the direct translation kind of critiques. And reading the original Japanese from that, I was like, yeah, it's not really doing anything, right? It's neutral. But there's actually a level of nuance there too. And this gets back to, and I'm glad you mentioned the word storytelling, because when we talk about the context of different languages, the context of Japanese and the context of English, one of the things you have to consider is the context of the genre that it's in. If you were to watch cartoons, American cartoons from the 80s, you would find that the writing in those cartoons is very, very different than the writing in the cartoons of, say, the 2010s. And I'm like, there was a Tarzan cartoon. Maybe I can think of something even more. Scooby-Doo, like original Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
Actually, very funny show, and pretty well done. But the writing in Scooby-Doo compared to, say, like Phineas and Ferb, it's almost a different genre.
Right.
The Scooby-Doo is, it keeps to its shtick. It's got, all that stuff. It's like, what to expect when you go in, and you'd be a little disappointed if you didn't have it. I'm also talking about like the 70s Scooby-Doo too. So it's even more stripped down than the later iterations.
Yeah,
right?
I don't watch the new stuff. I'm showing it to my kids, and I'm like, no, we do the old stuff, man.
Yeah, right on. Awesome. I'm sure there's good stuff in the new ones too, but whatever.
It just feels
and then you watch Phineas and Ferb, and there's like all these in jokes, and even like the opening trailer ends with like, Mom, Phineas and Ferb are making a whatever trailer or whatever. It's all this sort of like in meta jokes and that kind of stuff, so that the adults who are watching with their kids also get a kick out of it, and eventually the kids also start to understand that.
That is also a very funny show.
It's a fantastic show. In fact, I think they're both fantastic shows for their era. And the whole point of bringing this up is, when you read a lot of Japanese game writing, is designed for a particular audience that it doesn't care about wordplay. I don't know that they'd be confused by it, but it's just not what you expect. Like, you don't go into Scooby-Doo expecting them to break the fourth wall and make like meta jokes about Scooby-Doo. Newer ones, I'm sure, do that, but the old school, that's not what you expect, right? You want them to pull the mask off the guy's head at the end, and he's like, I would have gotten away with it. Like, and if you don't have that, it's not fun. And so the expectations of the genre that we're translating from are set, and they're honestly very different than the expectations you get from, like, say, Western games. If you play Hades, the way that the dialogue runs, like the jokes, like the constant sort of banter and stuff, it's hilarious. And that's sort of like this new Western style, this new mode of games. And back in the day when we were doing something like Final Fantasy XII, we were comparing it to things like BioShock, where BioShock, very gritty. Everything is painfully in the world. like Fallout, stuff like that, where if you set your, and I'm thinking about the original Fallout, where like if you set the intelligence of your character really low, everybody would just be speaking gibberish to you because it's so in the world that they're willing to throw out the story just to make a point about sort of role-playing games.
Wow.
And whereas in Japanese setting, Final Fantasy XII, your heroes are going to look great. Yeah, they grew up in a slum, but man, he looks good. Like, where do you get that haircut? And also height of fashion, right? It's not super realistic, but it also conforms to the expectations of the genre. And so when you're translating a game like that, you have to think, okay, what's the context I'm working out of, and what's the context I'm working into? And that's where I think you're going to get stuff like the clip from the game that you guys sent me the other day, where the Japanese is actually pretty bland. There's not a whole lot going on. And the English is going all over the place. And you look at that on the surface of it, and you're like, whoa, rogue translators,
yeah.
Call the cops, this is, something's going on here. And yes, something is going on here. They were taking something that was pretty bland and meant for an entirely different audience with entirely different expectations. And they're saying, how would this play against Hades? If we were going to go play a game that's like really sharply written with a lot of really like tuned characterization inspired by as much by the, by some original, but let's say I guess the original is the Greek myths, inspired as much by the Greek myths as it is by, say, Phineas and Ferb or Over the Garden Wall, or these sort of modern cartoons that are taking a real kind of like, they've got a sharp edge to the comedy and sharp characterization. And they're saying, how does this play against that? If you translated it directly from the Japanese, I would argue that it wouldn't play very well at all. Now, there might be an audience for that. And given that there are people on X that, say, hey, this is wrong, they're the audience for that, clearly.
There you go.
And maybe there's money to be made. Maybe there's a viable product there where you could make this sort of direct translation version of games and put it out. And like Manga Gene, people who want that sort of direct access and don't want any of the culturalization to go on would enjoy it. Maybe that's a cool thing to think about.
Yeah.
Well, you bring up competition. That actually explains almost more so than the marketing stuff, because market forces and political dynamics and I get that. But when you're talking about that, like there's movies will do this all the time. Well, my movie launches December 17th, but that's the same day as this other movie. How are they going to watch ours over that one? And that actually just kind of makes me wonder then in Japan, is there less competition in that area, where in the English they say we've got to include all of these things, we've got to write it, so the writing needs to be more elevated and all that stuff. Is there less competition in Japan over that same type of media?
Bingo.
Okay.
Yeah,
makes sense.
Less competition, and thus this sounds very pejorative, but I would say it hasn't evolved. Actually, no, I'm not being pejorative. It hasn't evolved in the same way that media has evolved in the West.
So if a guy writes a really good, or a girl writes a really good video game, do they just graduate and start writing anime and stuff instead, or and that way you never really, the video game writing tends to just kind of stay at a lower level because of the the hierarchy system in Japan?
Yeah, and actually, I kind of want to take a step back, and I know it was my words saying like lower level.
I know. I'm not trying to denigrate anyone.
No.
I just don't know how to talk about this stuff sometimes without using those.
Yeah, no, and honestly, that's how it feels a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But we could also, if we're being like super, super fair and nice, we can say in certain metrics, yeah, it's a lower level, but also it's a level that's designed specifically for an audience that expects that.
So once again, the mirror shows up.
Yeah. And a really good example of this is Dragon Quest. Compare Dragon Quest storytelling to Final Fantasy storytelling.
Yes, so that's a good example.
Very, very different.
Yeah.
Dragon Quest it's very happy being gamey.
Yeah,
it's very happy being like jokey, simple. And it doesn't mean it's a lower level. It means that's great, because that's what Dragon Quest is. And people who want to play that will play that. And that's awesome. And Final Fantasy, it's gotta be sort of like this romance, but at a little bit of a distance, and it has to have this sort of epic sweep to it, and it's just a different kind of game. So these are both products within that same culture, and yeah, there's a lot of when you compare it, like piece for piece with stuff made in the West, it's not going to come up very favorably for the Japanese titles, because they haven't grown in the same marketplace. And thankfully, the sheer force of Japanese pop culture and the spread of things like manga and anime, a lot of people have gotten very, very used to sort of the Japanese tropes, like the same old scene that they keep falling back on. And so they start expecting that, and whoa! Now we've got a market that actually wants that. Awesome, great for Japan, and I hope that there's enough of a market there, as well as sort of like the more mainstream market that doesn't know so much about Japan, or isn't looking for that authenticity.
Which is most people. I mean, it just think about it, right? It has to be.
It is still a niche. Granted, a much larger niche than it ever was before. And maybe it's a large enough niche that you can do some direct translation game things. And if somebody is spending this much effort and energy criticizing a localized product, put together a team, get the rights. That's totally viable. And that would be a really interesting thing to see, and a really interesting product. And you'd be adding something, to the world. So go for it.
Maybe in doing that, you would learn some of the reasons why the choices that are made are because
we're not here to learn, Mike.
Okay. Well, anyway, I want to step back real quick and talk a little bit more about the necessity, maybe not necessity, but at least to me, high importance of having a translator who's a good writer. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Alex. So another reason why I think it's really important, although that entire concept might raise a red flag to some critics, is that someone who is an excellent storyteller as well as being an excellent translator can look through that entire work, right, and see all the setups and the payoffs and why this is being set up the way it is and where this is going. And, they understand the structure of storytelling in such a way. They have a mastery over that. And so when they come to a big setup and they see that in this language, it was worded or put in this way, and maybe within that culture, like you're talking about expectation, whether it's a matter of that or whether there's some other cultural element that plays into, they would understand this from the scene, which is key to understand in order for this payoff to work later. I have to shift this a little bit, because if I translate it, more directly, it's possible that this will be missed by a large portion of the audience, and then the payoff won't be as strong. Is that something that you would agree with, or something that you, as you've done translation work, have encountered in any way?
All the time. I think it's very perceptive, and it gets back to storytelling. And another thing that needs to be said, one of the reasons that a translator might fundamentally change what's being said in the original in a particular spot is to conform to sort of the expectations of the new market, right? And we've kind of discussed that.
Yeah.
Another reason why they might change something is because there are fundamental differences in the way that Japanese approaches storytelling from the way that the West approaches storytelling, meaning, sort of Shakespeare, plot-driven, character motivation-driven storytelling. And even putting the language aside, I think you can find this sort of the sort of threads of very plot-driven, very character-driven storytelling in Western media, all through the spectrum. Stuff that's written terribly and stuff that's written, beautifully. Yeah. And whereas Japanese storytelling, traditionally, it's changed because there's been a heck of a lot of influence from the West, but traditionally is very, very focused on big moments, big scenes. The scene is sort of overall, and you can see this in kabuki as one of the traditional stage art forms where people have a general idea of what's going on in the plot, but it's not important. what's important is you get that moment where the guy gets out there and he makes his pose and he says that line that you've been waiting for, and everybody's like, yeah, and they like shout from the, like shout out the name of the actor and stuff. Like that's the big moment. And you see so much of that in Japanese games too, where it's everybody knows this moment's coming and you got to have this moment, but that's what you're waiting for. And it's not to say that that doesn't exist in Western storytelling either. It certainly does, but it's much more important in Japanese. And if you, in the pursuit of that moment, have to crush some like characters or crush some plot lines, not really a problem. Because that's not what's driving the story. What's driving the story is those expectations and those tropes, and that's perfectly cool for the Japanese market. And the fun thing about this is like that's pretty big picture, but it comes down to even the very sentences that are being used, and sometimes the difference in storytelling. This is something I ran into with Phoenix Wright a lot, where it's a comedy, which a lot of it is literally untranslatable because it just doesn't make any sense if you translate
the Japanese jokes. I don't think people understand this. Japanese jokes are very different from Western jokes.
That's fascinating. Could you explain why that is? I actually wasn't aware of that. Could you explain how that's
the context? Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I hadn't heard that before, like this big difference between the way Japanese jokes are told versus, maybe English or in Western cultures. Could you explain for the audience what that difference is?
Yeah, it kind of comes back to there's in Western storytelling, you have the sort of premise, setup, punchline, typically. Right. And then sometimes you'll have like a setup, twist, and the twist is the punchline.
Yeah, it's almost like a mini story in itself. There's definitely like an arc to it, or it moves very much like the structure of a joke is very similar to the structure of a story.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even on a scene by scene basis, if you read any script writing book, it'll say the scene has to go from like plus to negative or negative to plus. It has to have movement through the scene. You have to have this thing. And that's not always the case in Japanese storytelling. And this is all over the place, from movies and stuff like that. You may watch a movie, and if you watch it with the expectation of like, a Western thriller, that kind of thing, oftentimes you'll be disappointed. I don't know if you've seen The Ring, the original Japanese The Ring. The story's kind of a mess. It's all over the place. It's terrifying. It's has stuck. It sticks with you, and it's very effective in
the moments, right? The moments,
right?
Happen.
Crawling out of the well,
what you were talking about,
crawling out of the TV, like that's horrible. In fact,
that's all that's important.
Yeah, exactly. But the actual she was in the psychiatric ward or the blah blah blah. It's like, I kind of forgot because it wasn't laid out that clearly.
Yeah,
and we didn't really care. Compared to Western media, which is going to really focus on that, and it goes all the way down to those things. And this actually probably a good time to bring up the mistake that I made and got called out on, which was great.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear this
learning experience, and it's so long. I'm sure it's like NDA in some sense, but it's so long ago, and I've told this story before. So, and Nojima-san will get a kick out of it too. So this is Final Fantasy X, which was one of the first big games that I worked on. In fact, it was definitely the biggest game that I'd worked on. And it was also one of the first voice recording games that Square put out. There was some little bit of voice recording in Brave Fencer Musashi, and there was a little bit, but this was their first fully voiced title. And they went full on. Everything was voiced, even the tiny little NPC conversations that would totally not be voiced in later FFs, where everything was voiced. It was a massive script. And there's a whole nother story about the production and how completely insane that was. I still have trauma from that. The moment in Final Fantasy X where obviously we made a lot of changes, and probably most famously was towards the end of the game. There's a moment where, and sorry for the spoilers, it's like a 20-year-old game, so
We've also done a
Not on
full podcast on this in the past. We did a whole story analysis over like 12 episodes or something. So we've discussed it in full. So
oh wow, I'd love to see that actually. The first moment is because it was the one that went well and it didn't make a mistake, I think, was where at the end of the game they're standing on the airship and Titus and right, and Titus, it turns out, he was a dream, and he's starting to fade, and runs to him to embrace him and actually passes right through him because he's become sort of incorporeal, and she falls on the deck of the airship. She stands up and with a camera directly on her face, she says in Japanese, "Arigato." And the amount of money it took to create those like perfect lip flaps and like that perfect scene is phenomenal. So you're not going to change the lip flaps. Like whatever she says has got to come out of that mouth. And so you kind of, and what's your choice? So the word in Japanese is arigato, which if you look at it means thank you, right? So
yes, we talk about this exact translation choice in our podcast.
Yeah, you should. I think it was a really interesting choice. I mean, it was an incredibly interesting choice to make. And in fact, because I knew it would be controversial, I had that. And just for context, I'd gone to the US branch of Square. I had been doing most of the work in a hotel while we were doing the recording for FF10. And it's a very long story, but the short version of it is I had to rewrite most of the game the night before every day's recording because we had not prepared sufficiently for the very perfect lip flaps. Nobody knew that was a thing. I mean, in retrospect, duh, but at the time we didn't know. And so I ended up doing a lot of rewriting. Those last really big scenes of the game, I actually went down to the office so I could use a better VHS deck. That's the technology we're working with, so I could rewind quicker, basically, in order to rewatch a scene and write to lip flaps. And so I was off, like an hour away from our base where we were recording, and actually called Nojima-san, so the original writer of the game, because this wasn't being done, it wasn't simultaneous. He was already done work, and he came along for the recording. So he was there for most of the recording. Doesn't really speak English, but can read fairly well. And I'm sure his English is a lot better now. This was quite some time ago. But I actually called him and got him to come down and asked him, hey, look, there's this last big line here. And I showed him the scene. And I'm like, if she says what she says in Japanese, it's going to be a problem. And because if you directly translate arigato, you're going to get thanks or thank you. And if you're going to try to fit into those lip flaps, I guess thank you, maybe. But here's two people that have, star-crossed lovers. There was clearly there was a kissing scene. They were on this huge journey together, and this is the very end of that journey. And one of them is fading, and it's incredibly poignant. And she tries to embrace him and falls through, and stands up and says thanks. And then also we can't change this. She says that, and he turns and goes, like it's shocked. An intense reaction from him, right? It's you feel the full brunt of what she said, and the reason why is because arigato does not mean thanks in Japanese. Completely different context, and now we're taking it down to one word, right? Where arigato, it can mean thanks. Like if somebody gives me some candy or something, I go, oh, arigato, like, hey, thanks. Right. It can mean that. But also, picture the scene where the patriarch of a family is on his deathbed, and the generations have all gathered around, and they're all looking down at him, and everybody's crying, and it's clearly like this is the last. He looks up, and what's the thing he says in Japanese? He looks at all of them and he says, arigato. He's like, and it doesn't just mean thank you. It means you've done so much. There's so much has passed. I mean, literally, you can kind of overdo this, but literally means there was difficulties. Like if you look at the kanji that are used for arigato, it means ari is to exist, and Gato is this from, it's basically mukashi, like there were many difficulties. We've all come through so much. It's acknowledging everything that passed. It's a perfect word for that scene in Japanese. English doesn't use that, especially American English. We say I love you. That's the scene closer. That's how you get that look back where the guy goes, like that. And that's what you say when you're like, when you've not said it all that time and you've been through so much together and you have one chance to say something, you say, I love you, right? I mean, some people say it when they hang up the phone. It's that common in American English. So, however, the Final Fantasy had never used the word love before up until that point.
I didn't know that. Oh, yeah. Wow.
And that's actually fascinating, given the fact that FF8 was basically a romance story,
a love story,
and they never say that.
Nobody says "I love you" in FF8.
Wow. And a lot of that could come down to in Japanese saying "I love you" the way that I aishiteru or something is uncommonly. It's uncommon in Japanese to say something like that.
It's uncommon. It's a gauche.
But once again, okay, go ahead.
Oh no, please.
Well, once again, we're dealing not with a transliteration, the Chat GPT translation. We're trying to acknowledge the actual localization of the word arigato, And because they don't say "I love you," it doesn't mean that they don't ever convey "I love you" to people. It just means that they don't say those words the way that they would be translated, by a machine. But they do convey that feeling still using other words, and I think that's
Absolutely.
Probably.
And in an ideal world, and this is where I completely feel for critics who might be thrown by that kind of change, is in a perfect world she says arigato and everybody understands that. Yeah. Like, because I want them to understand how beautiful that is in the original and how moving that is. And frankly, like, for my money, I love you doesn't quite reach those levels. And this is another thing that I've been kind of skirting around, but translation is by necessity a very lossy process. Like when you're recording something from digital to like an old tape deck or something like that, you're losing a lot of data, or MP3s, you're losing a lot of data, right? And that happens no matter what you try to do. And so if you're translating something very delicate like a poem, you have to choose, okay, am I going to keep the rhythm of this? Am I going to keep the meaning of this?
The meter,
the meter of exactly, like the form. Sometimes you only get one. If you get two or three, that's pretty darn good. There are the rare exception where they just lucked into it, where they managed to get all three. But that's anyway, hardly an example to set your standards by. So the question is, what are you going to give back to the translation that's been lost? And how are you going to serve the scenes? And another way to think about this is to take another step back, is think about it as a director. And I inserted a little bit of this when I was talking about the "I love you" scene, which is how do you get that reaction from Titus when she says that? What's the words that get that reaction? What are the words that say this scene is done? Because thanks doesn't end a scene. So how are we going to end that scene, right?
Right.
And it's kind of a nice example because I think it works really well, and it's one of those rare moments where it turns out if you go, looks a hell of a lot like "I love you,"
right?
And that's just luck. That's just blind luck.
Yeah.
Like I'm glad that in English we don't say supercalifragilisticexpialidocious every time we want to say, express that feeling of "I love you," because then we'd have to pay a lot of money to redo the lips. So it is kind of like a nice example, like a little gem-like example. It just happened to work out in a lot of ways. But that kind of decision goes on all the time in localization, with varying degrees of truthiness or accuracy. So at the end of the day, you're like, okay, well, we lost a little bit here. We have to add a little bit here. Otherwise, we've done a disservice to the original by not carrying its message and what's good about it to the new audience. And that is a good way, I think, to think about it. To think, hey, how can I get this original, everything that's so great about the original, and how can I make it great for this new audience? You can also think about it in terms of like, if the original author of this, if Nojima-san was an English writer, what would he have said in this moment? Anyway, he was there. I asked him. He said,
Yeah. What did he say?
it's going to cause controversy, so let's do it. Like that was the level of it.
Once again, though, that is a marketing decision, right? That was his marketing mind making the decision for localization right there on the spot.
Absolutely. And and thank God he's such a cool dude and was into that. It was the only thing, however, the only translation decision of thousands that I and Aziz Hinoshita was also a translator on FF10. Yeah. So I think we basically did the whole thing together. So millions of decisions made, probably millions, but thousands of decisions made by Aziz and myself over all of those different line choices. And that was the only one that I actually ran by the original writer, which is a privilege, honestly. Many dev teams and many dev scenarios, you don't have that kind of access. So that was a very long prelude to the mistake that I made, which was also on Final Fantasy X. And Nojima called me out on it, and which is great. So we're sitting in the recording booth, and we're recording a scene between this is FF10, so it's Tidus. You've got three characters: Tidus, his dad Zect, and a kind of an uncle character is like friends with his dad named Auron.
Auron, yeah.
And in the now version of like the current events of the game, you have Tidus and Auron are kind of together. Like Auron's sort of taking Tidus under his wing. He's protecting him as a stand-in for his father, his estranged father, who is probably dead. And honestly, I forget all the details, but Zect, his dad, is no longer part of the story. And there is a scene fairly early on in the game. It's a flashback where Auron and Zect are up to something, and Auron says famous line, something like, we need to consider all the options or something like that. I don't remember what the line is. It doesn't really matter for this anecdote. And then blah, blah, blah happens. And at the end of the scene, Zek turns around. He's like, it'll work out. Nantoka narusa, something like that. And he's like, it'll all work out, right? And then that's the end of the scene, right? And then much later in the game, Auron is talking to Tidus. Different scene. And different era. It's like 20, 30 years later, and Tidus repeats the thing that Auron said in that earlier scene. He says the same thing that Auron is like. Didn't you always used to say, well, you need to consider all the options, something like that. And then when at the end of the scene he turns around and says, it'll all work out, echoing what his father said. But I'm sorry, that's what he says in English. In Japanese, he doesn't make a callback to what his father said. So here's the change. The original scene in Japanese, you have in the first scene, you have Auron and Zect, where Auron says something wise, and then Zect says, it'll all work out at the end of the scene. And then in the English, and then in the later scene, you have Auron saying something, Tidus repeating Auron's line, and then walking off. And I said, okay, when I was doing the translation, I'm like, okay, he's referring back to that earlier scene, but no one's going to remember what Auron said because it's buried in the middle of the scene and it wasn't particularly memorable, even though he's quoting him verbatim. Everyone's going to remember what Zect said at the end of the scene where he turns and he's got this super cool moment and he's like, hey, it'll all work out, right?
Right.
So I took those words from his dad and gave those to Tidus in the second scene. So it's a actual change, and I don't do this very often, but the reason why I did it was a much more memorable callback. It made more sense for Tidus in my mind. It made more sense for and granted this is like 23 years ago or something. It made more sense for Tidus's character at the moment, and also wrapped up that scene nicely because it was at the end of the scene, much more memorable, right? Nojima-san sitting there during the recording, he's like, oh, this doesn't say what it says in the Japanese, and I'm like, oh, right. And I hadn't even like anticipated that he was going to call me out on that because it's one of those like thousands of decisions you make all the time on a project like this. And so I turned around like, okay, I actually made a change here. I explained him the rationale because it was more memorable and the Zect line was just a better line, and that it came at the end. And I was being nice and being like, yeah, I liked it a bit at the end. And you're trying to refer to this thing that's buried in the middle of the conversation. Nobody's going to remember that. And Nojima sounds like, to his enduring credit, he's like, "You're right. The scene that you've written is a better scene. I think this works better. And if we could rewind time, I might have changed it in the Japanese." It's very nice of him to say that.
Mhm.
But at this moment, I want to show that Titus is beginning to accept Oron as sort of like a stand-in for his father, why he's been pushing him away, he's been holding him at arm's distance all this time. And at this point, he's starting to accept Oron. And so by repeating what Oron said, he's taking that step towards him. And I was like, that is an absolutely fair point. I didn't see that at all. It was a mistake. We changed the line on the spot and went on. So that's a place where, the translator is often sitting alone, or, they're lucky with a partner going through this, and they're having to make a lot of calls, having to make a lot of interpretations about what a scene means, all the different ways, like what's the information in the scene? How are the characters moving through the scene? What are their relationships doing? How have they changed from the beginning of the scene to the end of the scene? All of those things you have to consider. And, does it work from a directorial standpoint? And yeah, you're going to make some mistakes. And that I would say was a mistake. I mean, in the big picture, maybe not that big a deal. And right. maybe it is more important to have a more solid scene that goes off rather than this thing. Or maybe the character, those character arcs are more important. That's up for debate. I'm certainly happy to do since the original writer was right there. And I feel like my job is to make the original come across as best as it can. I'm more than happy to get that kind of feedback and correct those kind of errors.
That's awesome.
But I think that's just sort of fascinating. For me, it was a really fascinating moment where I was like, oh, that's how you go too far. in the thing, sometimes you need to go that far in order to make a scene work, and sometimes it didn't matter. Like maybe the original writer didn't have an idea. I was working on a game where I'm like, why is this character? It's got this really interesting name. Why are they named that? And the original writer said, oh, it's because they have big boobs. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe it's not all Shakespeare. Maybe this isn't all high art.
I love that.
Maybe we can stop being so self-serious and take a step back and kind of have a little fun with things too.
Sure,
that's great. I have. Oh, go Mike. You go first. But I have two more questions. I'm just dying to ask.
Well, I'll let you go first. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, first off, I want to just kind of briefly tell me: have you ever been have you ever been one of the critics? Right. Because I can think of a specific time when I first started learning Japanese, and I first was able to actually realize that they did not translate the words the way that I understood them. And I got upset. I was like, wait, why did they change it? Because my reason for getting into certain anime and certain things at the time was for the express purpose to learn Japanese. And it really bothered me when they took liberties with the translation, because then I started learning wrong words I started making wrong associations in my mind. It may work for the story, but I'm trying to learn a language here. Like stop screwing around. Did you ever have to go through a phase like that, similar to maybe what a lot of your critics have gone through?
No, because I didn't play Japanese games and I had no exposure to Japanese.
So anytime okay, very good.
Yeah.
You did learn it in a very unique way. I was very surprised to hear the way you learned Japanese. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I was mostly a language nerd and then literature / folklore nerd. I went into a PhD program for classical Japanese literature. I thought I was going to be an academic. And then after about 2 years of that, I'm like, it's not working. And I left. I quit the program and joined Squaresoft in California.
So you were already pretty dang good at Japanese by the time you even encountered a lot of this media that I'm referring to, right?
The first time I played a Final Fantasy game was prepping for the interview.
Oh, wow. See, I was trying to use the game as the tool to learn, and so that's where it got frustrating.
Also valid, my longtime translation partner and still a very good friend, Joe Reeder, who was equally, if not more, influential on things like Final Fantasy XII and how that work turned out.
Loved that.
He learned by playing video games.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and he completely agrees with everything I'm saying here today. I would say he's not. Yeah, he's not like want the original over the whatever.
Very good.
And because we both understand what it takes to make something of value out of the raw materials that were given by the Japanese.
Yeah. Then my last question is just about your meeting with Matsuno, if anything interesting there happened. But I don't want to take up all the time. We don't have a ton of time left. So, Mike, can we talk about Matsuno for a bit?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, Matsuno is among our favorite Japanese directors. So what was it like meeting him in person?
So one of my advantages going into all this was that I was completely new to the world of Japanese games. I had zero, like nobody had any star power whatsoever. Final Fantasy had zero star power.
Wow.
And if I'm being perfectly honest, I did come into it as kind of like a literature nerd, so I did have a bit of a chip on my shoulder.
Okay.
And when I was looking at a lot of the text, I was like, oh, I can do better than that. Yeah, I had that. Absolutely. Like guilty as charged. And I think that you would be insane to not to go into that business without having some idea of your own self-worth as a writer. Now, in retrospect, I think I was, I don't think it was terrible, but I'm embarrassed by a lot of my early work. Like, to be honest. Vagrant Story is a great example.
Oh, I love that script, man. I thought you did great, but
no, I love it too. And I think actually, for the time, it was literally the first thing of that size and that complexity that I'd taken on. I think I probably did a very good job. But looking at it now, it's like, ooh, you can't say half those lines. Like, it's not written for voice. Not that it needed to be, but like, I've learned a lot since then. And for me, like the gold standard for that is Final Fantasy XII, and it had less to do with me and more the fact that I was working with Joe, and every line in that game is one of us translated, the other one rewrote it, and and sometimes back and forth and back and forth, and we held each other to an impossibly high standard. And when I go back and look at that, like I wouldn't change a thing.
That's one of the best translated games I've ever played. Like,
awesome. I do agree.
So good. I love the English of that.
Yeah, but so back to Matsuno. He's a little daunting. He kind of talks a little fast, and he's like, no BS, no like, oh, you are from America, blah 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 blah. It's all like, how do we make this the best possible game possible? Let's go,
Good.
And although oddly, the first time I actually like sat down and did work with him is he wanted some like joke achievement names for Vagrant Story. I think these are in the final game, like the Order of the Platypus or something like that. I forget. Like if you get certain achievements, you can get these kind of funny. And he's like, give me some funny animal names. I'm like, I can do that job. And so that was kind of the first time that I really talked to him. The whole make it biblical thing actually was not a directive that I received when I first started on the project, because it was sort of, I hadn't really done anything full on my own at that point. It was given to another senior translator who, a Japanese guy, had never, I don't think he'd even been to the US. He'd certainly never lived in the US or outside of Japan. Learned all of his English from listening to NHK Radio English Hour. That's sort of like the public radio of Japan. Yeah. And for that, his English was phenomenal. Clearly a savant. Like, there's no way that I could have approached his English ability, and yet he lacked any cultural context or real depth to. Like, if you asked me to write something biblical in Japanese, I would really struggle, and the result would not be good. And I would actually turn you down from the beginning because I know that I'm not supposed to be doing that. Anyway, he had gotten this thing like, hey, I was supposed to make this opening scroll for the game, which is in the final. He's like, I was supposed to make this biblical, and here's my attempt at it. I was going to be his editor, his copy writer, basically. And I saw that and I was like, oh boy, well, like, what have I signed up for? Because for all of his, for who he was and his skill set, it was amazingly well done, but it didn't feel biblical. It didn't really feel like English, and over the intervening half year, we all kind of shifted positions, and he actually switched around to more of a editorial like checking role, like checking the translations against the original, where he excelled at that. And by the time that the project actually started going full time, I was the main translator about half a year later. So that original directive, and why wasn't the original Japanese biblical? That's because the Bible wasn't written in Japanese.
There you go. Say no more.
Which is a smarmy way of saying Japanese there's another context here, which is the global and historical context of a language. And this is something you see actually really plays a part in Final Fantasy XII in the localization there too. And so it might make a little more sense talking about it there, where you've got an entire fantasy world with different disparate cultures. And in our real world, where these languages come from, Japanese is spoken pretty much only in Japan. There's like fairly large community in, say, like Peru. There's a large expat community in Hawaii, but they're essentially speaking standard Japanese. There's not a whole lot. There's some variation within Japan itself. You've got the northern dialects, and you've got like Osaka dialect, and you've got some southern things there. But those are very much tied to their area. So think about its context historically. You've got modern Japanese. You've got the language as it was actually spoken in, say, like 800 AD, which I've heard reproductions of. Very different language. It's kind of like Old English versus modern English. And then you've got the language as it was presumably spoken in the Edo period, so like 1700s, 1800s. But nobody really knows. There were so many different dialects, and it was such like a huge cultural explosion time that there was all this, all these different dialects going on. The best we can get there in Japanese now is sort of the fake samurai lingo, the stuff that's used in Shogun very well, actually, which is we could have another episode about Shogun.
Oh my goodness. I would love to talk about Shogun, because I read that book for the first time, I think 4 years ago, and loved it. And I thought that they did amazing as an adaptation for the TV series. That was great.
It's gorgeous. Yeah, it's fantastically done, and the level of attention to Japanese and the culture, it's beautiful. Friends much more knowledgeable about this. Hiroko Yoda is a writer. Definitely look her up. She's done whole like breakdowns of like the kimono they're wearing, the various way that people bow or sit, and all the stuff that they got right with the show. She's done these great breakdowns of it. So definitely look that up.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, the whole point of this is, so Japanese historically, if you're going to give something historical spin in Japanese, that's pretty much your go-to, is like the Shogun style. It's called jidaigeki in Japanese. It's, if you watch any samurai show, they're going to be talking like that.
Yeah.
So now let's put that in the context of this huge fantasy world. What kind of Japanese are they going to be speaking in Bujarba? This like a land of floating islands that used to be run by the empire, but has now been cast off and has its own indigenous culture. Like, what kind of Japanese do they speak there? Do they speak Osaka Japanese? That's weird. Yeah. Do they speak Hawaiian Japanese, like with like English pidgin words thrown in? Nah, probably not. So the answer is, did they? And then here's the empire, like the Rabanastre and sort of like the rebellion people. They speak modern Japanese, fine, no problem. What about the empire? They've got these huge suits and stuff like that. Maybe they speak like samurai. That's weird. This isn't Tokugawa. This isn't Shogun. Right. Why are they? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit the. No, they should speak standard Japanese. Maybe a little fancier. A little fancy. Some more difficult words you can throw in there. But other than that, you're not going to go too far in any direction because it's weird. It just doesn't sit right. So Japanese is standard throughout the world. Now take that in an English context. If everybody in the world of Final Fantasy XII was speaking with a modern, let's say, SoCal accent, like, hey, dude, how's it going? That would be very disconcerting, right? Because it doesn't conform to our concept of a realistic world. And
the expectations that you were talking about, right? We're in fantasy, in Western fantasy, it's almost always some form of British English, right?
Medieval for English means England, right?
Yeah. And we certainly didn't reinvent the wheel for FF12. We're like, it was good enough for Star Wars, it's good enough for us. Empire
Good
speaks
point.
British.
Yeah, Tarkin.
Yeah. And not to mention that there's more than that connection to Star Wars in the story of FF12. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
Fran is Chewie.
Yeah.
Come on. But basically, there's no reason to like break those kind of expectations. If you can play to them, and you can play to them in an interesting way that gets people really involved in the world. So Empire is British English. The Rabanastre, the Rebellion, is American English, but circa 1930. But again, not like regional, it's not like Gangsters in Chicagoland or anything like that. It's sort of like your standard sort of, American English at that time.
Yeah.
And then Bujerba, which is this colony. It was an indigenous culture that was colonized by the empire and is now left to its own devices. What's a good analog for that? Well, the most obvious one is India, colonized by the Brits and then left to its own devices.
Right.
But there's a problem in Hollywood. If you say, hey, give us an Indian accent, 9 out of 10 times, even if you're bringing in like a native sort of an Indian American actor, the strength of Apu and the Simpsons is so strong and overwhelming that you're either playing to that stereotype or you're playing against it. Right. And so we actually sidestepped the whole thing and went with Sri Lankan English, which is related to Indian English. Yeah. It's close, but it's got its own thing. Huh. And we took one step, and this is the same thing for Fran and the Vieira, where what we did was we picked one touchstone, and we did this for all the different languages. We said, okay, Sri Lankan. I had a recording of a Sri Lankan radio announcer speaking in English from like the 70s or something like that, and we had a guy. I think his name's Kane, Tom Kane. He's passed away since. Somebody can fact check me on the name. Fantastic voice actor, white guy from Iowa, I think. Yeah. He was the voice of UPS for years. He also does an insane Morgan Freeman impersonation. In fact, he's Morgan Freeman's voice double. So when Morgan Freeman voices things like March of the Penguins, he has it in his contract. He just does the first pass because he's got other things to do. And then if they need to do any pickups, which they always do, they bring in a voice double.
Wow.
So this guy was the voice double, and you could close your eyes and it's Morgan Freeman. Amazing voice actor. Cool. We had him listen to the Sri Lankan radio announcer and give his own kind of interpretation of that accent. And then we used his accent as the touchstone for all the other actors.
Wow.
So we're basing it on real world, but then we're running it through this filter of a voice actor and then making him the basis. Similarly with Fran, and I'm blanking on her name. She was actually in one of the Star Wars films. The woman who did Fran, she was in like the second of the sequel of the prequels. Yeah. She's like one of Amidala's like henchwomen or something. You see her.
Really?
And anyway, also a fantastic actor. We played her clips of Bjork talking, obviously. And so she's doing this Icelandic accent. Then Japanese, the Vieira speaks standard Japanese, but they all speak with a very low tone, which is interesting and it's unusual. And you don't expect the bunny girls to be speaking with this kind of low register. Huh. And so they're doing something to set it off in Japanese. How do we set it off in English? And there's similarly, things like that with sorry, I'm going on ad nauseam.
Keep going. This is
amazing.
Yeah. The Okuria, we're like, okay, how are they going to speak? And we had a bunch of British stage actors doing the Okuria, one in particular, remotely from London. And we're like, well, let's play to their strengths. We wrote all of the Okurian dialogue in, I think it's iambic tetrameters, like 4 beats iambs.
Yeah, that was true even in Final Fantasy Tactics. I think at least the retranslation of it for the PSP version or whatever, but all the demons in that spoke that way too.
Yep. And of course, because they're brilliant actors, they didn't do it like like you're standing on a stage, blah blah blah. They read it fairly naturally, but you still get that rhythm. It's kind of like laced in there as an undertone, and it works great as a way of elevating their speech and making it, otherworldly and that kind of stuff. And no, the original Japanese was not in any iambic meter. That doesn't exist in Japanese.
So whose call was it then to start differentiating the English like all around the world?
That it was our call. Joe and I basically made the call.
Cool.
We probably ran it by some people, because we were in fairly close contact. And Matsuno had personally reached out to me when he was still on the project to get me involved. So I think we probably at this point had our act together a little bit more and wrote up a pitch document and said, hey, we kind of want to do things like this.
Very cool.
Any issues, that kind of thing. So it was with the sort of approval and sometimes tacit approval of the originals.
Can you imagine, Alex, if you had released Final Fantasy XII as translated in this time? How much that might have been an issue for people online, like even though you had reached out to, and gotten permission and even maybe some direction on the part of Matsuno and the Japanese dev team. But there's obviously some big changes made there and decisions made. Like, why aren't we giving that same grace, or at least why are we jumping to an assumption? So quickly, but the result is, as Kaysen, I would agree with Kaysen that Final Fantasy XII has got to be among one of the best translated games I've ever seen, ever.
Yep.
All thanks to Joe. When I look back at it, yeah, it's a rare project too, and this gets back to what I was talking about, the levels of stuff that you're working with. The Matsuno stuff and the Matsuno inspired stuff is at a different level than so much of the other material that you might have to translate as a localizer. And those projects were few and far between. And, they set a really high bar and also really play to a lot of English strengths because Matsuno is such a Western story geek. He loves histories. He loves American sitcoms. He totally gets that, and so he's bringing a lot of those storytelling tactics, which is why it's actually in a weird way a lot easier to translate his material because so much of it just works. With Vagrant Story, a lot of the lines that people are like, yeah, best line ever, that's a direct translation. You could have ChatGPT'd it. Yeah, I am the reinforcements. I didn't write that. That's
awesome.
Yeah, that's a direct translation. A lot of it obviously wasn't a direct translation too. But yeah, and if you've got another 3 hours, we can go into the
well, I'll say this. We've hit the 2 hour mark, and that's what we had agreed to do. And I could absolutely talk to you for another 5 hours probably, but I want to get a beat on where you're at in terms of what you need to get done for the day and whatnot, and where we should wrap up.
I've got a little extra time. We should be fine. I've got some guests coming later on. But
okay,
10 or 15 minutes, or
yeah, sure, yeah.
Sure. Okay.
So I apologize to those of you who sent me questions for Alex, because I wanted to kind of get to those towards the end. But now that we've wrapped up, there's two things in particular that I really wanted to ask. The first one is going back a little bit to your point about translation being a lossy process. The first thing that jumped to my mind when you said that was lyrics, translating lyrics from one language to another. Because not only do you have, the normal lossiness of it, but you're also trying to now rhyme and write more like poetry, and this word's not going to rhyme, right? So if I read some of your credits, it says that you did lyrics for Melodies of Life in Final Fantasy IX. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So you translated those lyrics. How difficult is that to write a beautiful piece of poetry in English that is as close as possible, like we're saying, to the Japanese? You're trying to be respectful to that, but it's another level of difficulty. How do you approach that?
I think the trick with that, as with all of these, is making sure that you set your priorities correctly. You have to understand what your job is as a translator vis-a-vis the requirements of the work, whether it's that big I love you scene in Final Fantasy X, or it's fitting lyrics to a melody. And there are some places where you can compromise. In the case of lyrics, I'd say like meaning, you can compromise as long as you're in the ballpark. Impact, you can't compromise. If there's a line in that song that, you know, is going to bring somebody to tears, or is going to make somebody, you know, think, or like an image, you got to get that through, even if it's in a slightly different place or with a slightly different emphasis. Another thing where you can't compromise is it's got to fit the melody. You have to be able to sing it. There's another trick here, which is Melody's Life is sung by the original Japanese vocalist, who's not a native English speaker. And so not only do we have to write lyrics that fulfill all those other requirements, but they've got to be something that can be sung by a Japanese person. And I was in the recording studio, like feeding her lines, like telling her how to do elisions and sort of, you know, mush sounds together in order to make it sound natural in English. So helping out a little bit, but there's some, you know, you're not going to make a Japanese person say certain things, like a lot of like sounds and that kind of thing. It's going to be a nightmare. So that kind of consideration also comes into it. One trick that I did actually many more lyrics than are probably listed in anything online, because I did some work for Avex and some like a Japanese label translating lyrics for a rock group or two and that kind of thing. And one of the tricks that I settled on that I really like is listening to the Japanese over and over and over again, and hearing where it starts to sound a little bit like English, and then using those words as much as possible.
That's fascinating.
And it's a really fun way. It's really, I mean, it's hard because, you know, it doesn't always work out, but when it works out, it feels great. There was one line I remember in this, oh wow, I remembered the name of the band. The band is called Missile, and the song is called Go My Way. And this is like you know, nobody knows these people. It's like they're big for a brief blip in the early 2000s, I think. They were doing some show thing, and they had to have lyrics, and they were going to sing in English. And there was a line in the Japanese that was talking about, I think the phrase was "kimochi o warikiru," which is like a good way of describing it. You know, kimochi is like your feelings, and warikiru is to like put them aside, right? Or to, you know, to separate them.
Yeah, divide, yeah.
Yeah, and so he said like kimochi warikiru, blah blah blah. And warikiru sounds a lot like why kill in English.
Oh, that's good.
And so in English, it became why kill every little feeling inside of me, right? Which is like that kimochi warikiru. And I forget the thing, but it made sense in the context of the song.
Brilliant.
And you get like those moments, you can tell in the recording studio, you can tell like the singer like grabs onto it because, oh, it's familiar. Like I know how to do that part. I know how to emote that. And so it's like you're throwing them little bones here and there that they can build their performance around, because for them it's, you know, they're performing that as a sound, a piece of sound. And so the more help you can give them in that regard. So yeah, it's hard. You lose a lot by necessity, but you go for those little wins wherever you can get them.
That's fascinating. I love that. My last question that I wanted to ask you, this is more just a personal thing on my part, but I love just the dialogue, the language of Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy XII. Obviously, there's a lot of allusions back to more of like an early modern English mode there. Feels a little bit Shakespearean, maybe a little bit King James Bible-y. And I was curious as to, because you've described yourself a couple times now here as a literature nerd. So did you grow up reading like the King James Bible or reading Shakespeare? Like, how did you gain a mastery of that particular mode of English?
You're reading a lot. Although honestly, more than like Shakespeare or King James Bible, although I did read both of those. Although I honestly didn't understand Shakespeare until I was maybe 40.
Yeah, that's the difference. Right. Yeah.
It's not. Yeah, it is not. And the writing in Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy XII, it's not Shakespearean. 12, I think, and if anything, this is something that Joe brought to the project. It does have moments of that sort of elevated. especially when the judges are talking to each other.
Right.
Oh yeah.
That's exactly
Some
what I
of
was
that
thinking about.
was intentionally Shakespearean, but my reference points were Tolkien,
Okay.
who's a gorgeous writer,
Oh yeah.
and then later on Gene Wolfe, who's very Dickensian, who draws a lot of like Dickens, sort of the wordplay and that sort of thing.
That's right.
And then George R. R. Martin, which is now it's kind of obvious to say Game of Thrones now, and you can overdo that, but Game of Thrones came out just God, when was it? It was I was reading that around the time that I was working on some of those games, and I read that. I read it like 8 times at least, and even when I started doing novel translations, I went through and like listed all the ways that he said, she said. You know, that's sort of like the comma, the
Yeah.
attribution stuff. How do you do that? Like who, you know? And it turns out every writer does it slightly differently. But like very text level analysis without aping any of those things, because it is coming from the Japanese. But then you can use that as a filter, and then this is more like early like literature nerd stuff on Vagrant Story, but like there was a lot of sort of weird imagery and stuff in Vagrant Story, and I decided that, in my ultimate wisdom, of course, that hey, you know, what have we said that this wellspring or this like source of spirits in the world, we'll call it a wellspring. And then we'll do what's called a leitmotif, where you make these callbacks to that motif in your choice of language. So there's a lot of water words. There's a lot of sibilants, you know, S sounds. Whenever we're talking about the spirits and stuff, you start moving those things in there. So, and those are things that they kind of fly under the radar, much in the way that, like, if you do something in iambic, you know, tetrameter or iambic pentameter, but you don't actually say it like that. It can kind of fly under the radar, but you still. Oh, excellent example: the HBO series Deadwood. There are some characters that speak all in iambic pentameter. You wouldn't know it, but it sticks with you. Al Swearingen, like a lot of the stuff he says, is in iams, and you wouldn't know. Like, he's not like reading it like he's on stage, but you feel it when you get that rhythm. And so that's the kind of thing that English loves doing. And in fact, it feels empty. And you know what? Before this podcast ends, something that I absolutely have to say. Let me think about it momentarily to get it right. The vast majority of criticism that I see online levied towards translations is that they changed something. But to my mind, a far more prevalent problem is when they don't do enough and you end up with something that's dead on the page or dead on the screen. And that more than anything else is a disservice to the original. And
very good.
I feel like that's gotta be said. It's a much worse problem. And I would, for my money, I'd much rather have translators out there taking chances, messing up, going too far, getting better at their craft, listening to the audience, making course corrections when they need to, but also trusting their sort of inner voice and their inner understanding of how to tell a story. And I'd much rather having them making mistakes out there than making the mistake of like not doing enough. And and they're not doing it because they don't have the courage or something. Sometimes they're not allowed to. Or it's like it's such a dispersed project that one translator of 8 working on the same scene can't have that kind of influence over the scene. And so you end up with this sort of like mediocre mishmash. And that's a much, much more prevalent problem than anything that I see called out on X.
That's almost any like design or writing by committee. It's always a way to just really get vanilla, just bland.
Lowest common denominator.
Yeah. That's
slurry.
What passes committees. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
Well, Alex, I just want to thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation. This has been super enlightening for me. I'm sure it's going to be true for the audience as well. I've been wanting to chat with you for years. I can't say it enough. I truly admire the work that you've done in the gaming space. And I'm actually really interested in playing some of the games that you've been writing recently. So I'm going to make some time for that for sure. And I just want to say to those listening to this, this is kind of a hot topic. Again, sometimes we talked about, maybe there's an audience for this, for people who want something direct. And I think that's a really, really interesting takeaway from this, something to think about. As you are online and as you're encountering these conversations, if there's any part of this conversation that we've had, this discussion that we've had that can add to that or can maybe enrich that discussion or bring more nuance to it, feel free to share. But I just want to say again, Alex, thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure's been mine.
Thank you.
We will see you guys again next week for our next episode. Until then, have a great week and peace out.